On the afternoon of December 23, 2015, a call center at a Ukrainian electricity company started ringing. Then it kept ringing. Thousands of calls, all at once, none of them from customers. And every real customer sitting in a cold, dark apartment, trying to report an outage, got a busy signal. That flood of junk calls was deliberate. Somebody wanted the utility deaf at the exact moment it went blind. Which tells you something uncomfortable about who was on the other end of this. They weren't testing anything. They already knew how a power company responds to a crisis, and they'd planned around it. By the end of this, you'll understand something most coverage of this attack skips. The malware everyone names in the headlines wasn't what opened the breakers. The operators who watched it happen weren't hacked out of their own consoles by some mysterious ghost. What actually took the lights out was mundane, and that's exactly why it worked, and why it's still the most instructive grid attack on the public record. Everything I'm about to describe comes from the U.S. ICS-CERT alert, the joint SANS, ICS, and E-ISAC analysis published in early 2016, and reporting from outlets that had people on the ground. You can go read all of it. Here's the version most people carry around. December 2015, Russian hackers used a piece of malware called Black Energy to shut down part of Ukraine's power grid. 230,000 people in the dark. First confirmed cyberattack to cause a blackout, anywhere. That summary is broadly fair. 3 distribution companies were hit. The ICS-CERT alert names the roughly 225,000 customer figure. Black Energy 3 was found on the networks, but the shorthand collapses months of work into one word, and it puts the blame on a file when the real story is about people, patients, and legitimate access being used exactly as designed. So let's go back to the beginning, which is nowhere near December. The entry point was email. Spear phishing messages carrying Microsoft Office attachments, sent to people inside the IT and business networks of these companies. Open the document, get prompted to enable macros, and the attackers had a foothold. That's it. No exotic zero-day, no undisclosed flaw in a control system. A document and a click. And the SANS and E-ISAC analysis is clear that this happened well before the outage, in some cases many months before. So the obvious question is, if they were inside since spring, what were they doing for the rest of the year? Because they weren't sitting still. They were shopping. What they harvested was credentials, usernames, passwords, the keys to remote access, and they took their time mapping how the business network connected to the operational side, where the actual grid controls live. In several of these environments, there were remote access paths into the control network, the kind engineers use legitimately to log in from elsewhere. Those paths existed for good reasons. They also existed without the kind of two-factor protection that would have made a stolen password useless. The analysis published by SANS and E-ISAC highlights exactly that gap. So the attackers didn't need to break the control system. They just needed to log into it. But logging in isn't the same as knowing what to do next. And this is where the attack stops looking like crime and starts looking like a study. 3 separate companies, hit within roughly half an hour of each other, using different distribution management systems. You cannot coordinate that by accident. Somebody had spent months learning each environment, which switches, which substations, what the operator sees on screen when a breaker opens. The record supports that reconnaissance was extensive, and the timing across the 3 utilities was tight and deliberate. So when December 23rd arrived, The attackers weren't experimenting. They were executing a plan they'd already rehearsed against the real thing. And the first move wasn't the breakers. It was the room. Operators at Prikarpati Oblenergo described watching their own cursor move. Not a glitch, not a frozen screen. The mouse pointer sliding across the distribution management interface, clicking through breaker controls, and locking them out of their own workstation while it worked. This is the detail that made the story famous, and it's in the contemporaneous reporting from journalists who interviewed the staff. Imagine sitting in that chair. You can see the substations going offline. You can see who's doing it. You can't stop it with the keyboard in front of you. And then the screens started going away entirely. Because the attackers weren't just opening breakers, they were making the recovery as slow and painful as they could. Firmware on serial to Ethernet converters at substations was overwritten, so devices that translate control commands into something field equipment understands stopped working and couldn't simply be rebooted back to life. Uninterruptible power supplies feeding the control centers were reconfigured, so when the lights went out at the utility went out too. And a wiper component called kill disk was used to destroy files and boot records on machines inside these networks, meaning the workstation's operators would need to regain control were themselves ruined. That's not sabotage of a grid. That's sabotage of the response. Then the phones. The telephone denial of service against the call center is documented in the SANS and E-ISAC analysis, and it belongs in the same category as the firmware wiping and the destroyed workstations. It has no effect on electricity whatsoever. Its only function is to stop information reaching the company that needs it. A distribution utility learns where an outage actually is largely from customers calling in. Choke that channel, and you've blinded the operator a second way, on top of the wiped consoles. Which brings us to the part that gets buried under the malware name everyone repeats. Black Energy 3 did not open the breakers. That's the reveal, and it's the finding investigators were most careful about. Black Energy was the access tool, the thing that got in through those office documents and let the attackers move around. Kill disk was the cleanup crew. Neither of them contained code that understood a distribution management system. The breakers were opened by hands on a keyboard, using the utility's own control software, through legitimate remote access with stolen credentials, which is a much harder problem than malware because there was no malicious file for an antivirus tool to flag. At the moment it mattered. Everything the operators would have looked for looked like a colleague logging in. So, how do you catch that? In the moment, you mostly don't. Detection came from the physical world, not the digital one. The lights went off. Substations dropped out. Staff saw a cursor moving that nobody was driving. The attack announced itself by succeeding, which is the worst possible way to find out. And the honest lesson from the published analysis isn't that better antivirus would have stopped it. It's that stolen credentials on remote access paths, without a second factor, and without monitoring for logins that look normal but shouldn't be happening, is how a determined intruder walks into a control room. What saved Ukraine that night was people. Field crews drove out to substations and closed breakers by hand, manually, the way it was done before any of this was automated. Power came back for most customers in roughly 1 to 6 hours depending on the company, according to the ICS-CERT alert and the follow-up analysis. But the control centers themselves took far longer to restore, because the workstations and the converters had been destroyed rather than merely disrupted. If this channels the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because the manual fallback that rescued Ukraine is exactly what a lot of modern utilities have quietly stopped practicing. And the human stakes are worth stating plainly without dressing them up. This was late December in Ukraine. Around 225,000 customers, which means far more actual people, lost electricity in winter for hours. Heating, lighting, elevators, medical equipment at home, the ability to phone anyone about it. The published record does not describe deaths from the outage, and I'm not going to imply otherwise. But an outage in that season is not an inconvenience, and the people who fixed it did so in the cold, on foot, at substations, on Christmas week. Now, what the record doesn't settle. Attribution is the big one. The tooling and the operation have been widely linked in public reporting and by security firms to a Russian nexus group, and that assessment is broadly held. But ICS-CERT's own alert is careful. And there's a real difference between a strong industry assessment and a proven chain of evidence you could take into a courtroom. The public documentation does not close that gap for us, so treat the attribution as well supported and still, formally, an assessment. The other unsettled piece is scope. Reporting at the time indicated more Ukrainian energy companies were probed or compromised than the three that actually lost power. And the public record has never fully mapped how far that access spread, or how long some of it sat unused. There's also the question of intent. Was December 23rd the objective, or a demonstration of a capability the operators wanted to prove worked? Nobody outside the group that did it can answer that, and I'd rather say so than guess. What we can say is that the pattern didn't stay theoretical. A year later, in December 2016, another attack hit a transmission substation near Kyiv. And this time researchers found something new, a piece of malware built to speak grid protocols directly, without a human on a keyboard. That's the trajectory. Hands-on in 2015, automated in 2016. The 2015 attack was the proof that legitimate access is enough. Everything after was refinement. So if you take one thing from December 23, 2015, take this. The attackers never needed to defeat the grid's engineering. They needed an email opened in the spring, a password nobody rotated, a remote access path without a second lock, and the patience to spend months learning a control room they'd never physically entered. Then they turned the lights off with the utility's own software and hung up the phones so nobody could say where it hurt. The technical part was the easy part. Next case file, we're going to the 2016 attack, the one where the operators found code that didn't need a person at all. And the strangest part is what investigators believe it was actually designed to do beyond opening breakers. That one's stranger than this one, and far less resolved.